Welcome back to News in Focus. Now, inflation and a broader cost of living crisis are taking an immense financial and mental toll on South Africa's domestic workers. That's one of the standout findings for the 7th annual SweepSouth Report on pay and working conditions for domestic workers. Now, the report, which has tracked progress in the pay and working conditions of domestic workers since 2018, also reveals that living costs for the average domestic workers have increased by 15% in the past year, dwarfing the 5% earnings increase they accrued over the same period. Now, joining us to discuss this, I'd like to welcome the Group CEO from SweepSouth, Luke Kannemeyer. Luke, good day. Thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
My absolute pleasure to join you today,
Yeah.
and very looking forward to sharing with your viewers more detail about SweepSouth's report.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Okay, look, so talk to us about the collection of the data and how are you able to go ahead and really compile what was a very accurate and really detailed report on, the lives of many of the domestic workers across the country.
So I'm not sure if necessarily
Mm,
everyone's familiar with what
mm,
SweepSouth
yeah.
is. We are a technology platform started 10 years ago in South Africa, in Johannesburg, wanting to take on an age-old industry that we really did see was in need of disruption to get rid of some of those age-old ways of doing things which didn't necessarily bring dignity and dignified pay. And that was when, early on in our journey, we realized, cool, were we actually doing what we set out to do? And to do that, we then came up with this survey that then we were over three different city or four large South African metropoles. And we wanted to get a representative view of how are we doing versus the rest of the market. And from there, it has grown into one of the largest survey of its kind in the world, actually, that looks at a comprehensive view this year, 5,600 domestic workers, 92% of them women, 8% of them that were men, and delved into many different of their characteristics, their lives, their work experiences, and pay.
Look, I mean, you look at, of course, the stats, and it's quite telling that, you've got these domestic workers that had suffered a lot through COVID-19, given the restrictions that were there. When you follow the trail, of course, we're 2 years out from the pandemic, but still now in the year 2024, you're still seeing really difficulties with regards to the domestic workers. So talk to us about the importance of really collecting data from those dark days of the pandemic in March 2020 and up until, May or June 2022, when, the government of South Africa had really said that the COVID-19 pandemic could return, well, South Africa could return to its normality post the pandemic.
I think this is where we really, in the early parts of the pandemic years, try to take a thought leader role here in terms of trying to digest those gazettes as to exactly what did they mean for domestic workers, and especially the market at large, those who had private workers. Could they actually come into your home? And I think that was where, we faced severe constraints as a business during that time. But it was vitally important, as you say, that during those trying times, it's often the most vulnerable who are impacted and affected. And I think that that was where very early on we saw that this was one of the industries that took the most significant knocks just due to the nature of the industry going into people's homes. But I think something here that you see compounded with domestic workers by their very nature is they are reliant upon their employers, who, once their employers, so primarily mostly the middle class, who are becoming under increasing pressure, and especially many losing their incomes in those early COVID days, that passed on to domestic workers. And I think that is where we saw probably the most substantial finding to me during that period was how workers had to pull back on variable cost items, so especially food. And that nutritional deficit that we saw during that time, because especially we saw the number of financial dependents go up, we saw that schools were closed, so the learners were not getting their meal at schools during the day. And we saw that, many workers were feeling that their mental health was affected as well, because many people accessed faith-based communities in order to, look after themselves holistically. And that's where we try and create this larger picture of looking at domestic workers in a more zoomed out fashion, looking at these different facets of all these knock-on effects. And I think this is where, for me, it's something that probably we would want to revisit next year. But I do hope as a country, we recognize what was sacrificed during those years, and that pulling back on food and nutritional intake during that time, I suspect will be with us for probably for this generation.
Look, 37 Rand per hour, that's of course the average pay that many domestic workers take home. And I mean, both you and I, and it doesn't even need a rocket scientist to tell you this, that really is a difficult supposed wage to earn per hour. I know there's various stakeholders that need to come to the party. One of them, of course, being those who employ these domestic workers, but the other, of course, that being, the Department of Labor and government in itself, in really coming to the party and saying, well, there needs to be a real look at that. From SweepSouth's report, and of course your engagement with various stakeholders, how do we change that 37 Rand to be something a little higher? Because, as I said, it's really something that's not livable at this current economic conditions.
I think this is something where, as you say, that there are many different role players involved. I think that there is a role that government needs to play in terms of, if we really zoom out, a lot of this is a consequence of how our country is doing in terms of the growth of salaries and the growth of the economy. But when we look at our most vulnerable and the precariousness that they face, it really is looking at our social security net. How do we reinforce that to ensure that during these periods where, when employers are under pressure and domestic employees are also under pressure, that we're able to supplement some of those things around. But I also think that from a employer's perspective, if that, there's some creative ways that we can look at increasing pay or ensuring that you're able to pay a living wage. If you're having to pull back on your the pay, or you're finding it quite unaffordable, maybe it is that you still keep a worker employed, but you just don't have them for all the hours. And then, maybe you can share that with the auntie next door, that both of you supplement the pay of that worker. She gets a living wage, and you're able to pay something where you feel that this is a dignified and a living wage. Because, as you say, the 27.58 an hour that's prescribed for domestic workers, in the grand scheme of things, and as our findings saw, that 46% of workers are actually earning below that was surveyed. There really is this pressure on workers to only eke out a living, take care of their basic costs. But when it comes to things like education and advancing themselves, advancing their families, saving, this is such a precarious type of employment that really, we do need to look at better protections where the state comes to the party, and we look at employers also taking some ownership.
Luke, one final question to end this conversation. What we've seen with many of these domestic workers is that a lot of them work on a part-time basis, or what we as media practitioners would say freelance basis. But there's a rarity now where we find domestic workers actually working on a full-time basis. And that, of course, means, tracking from, their banks or from government, from the Labor and Employment Department, in really, seeing, where is the trends with regards to the part-time basis and the full-time basis. From SweepSouth's perspective, is that something that you've been looking at in terms of really finding a way where there can be this tracking of either the fast part-time or the full-time basis, and really measuring the sort of income that is differentiated between the two of it?
So yes, so we did look at this in terms of our survey. So I do encourage people to go to SweepSouth.com. That's where, you can use our service, but there's a banner at the bottom of the page that links through to all of this rich data for you to get a much bigger and more rich picture around this. But what we are seeing, and this is also where SweepSouth has been able to really provide more employment for workers is that the full-time employment of workers has plummeted. Very, very few people can continue to afford that. And we do see this big divide that there are those, who are still earning generous salaries, who are in a position to afford large pay towards their workers. But we do see that workers who generally have, on average, around 3 employers, that's the nature of this work now. It is usually a multi-employer model, that they do earn on average more per booking. And I think that's what obscures sometimes, where people maybe aren't keeping up, that when they break down their monthly or weekly pay that they're giving to a worker, that hourly rate, which is now how minimum wage is dictated nowadays, is not being adhered to. And I think just the end of the legal things that you speak about, I think, we can look at enforcement, but the first thing we need to do is really promote access. We have great legislation, but it should be just as easy for you and me. We can sign up for bank accounts now using a selfie. Why is it that this is such a tedious and difficult process for employers to do the right thing in terms of UIF, in terms of occupational health and safety, or COIDA? Because I do believe that at their hearts, most domestic employers want to do better.
Luke, thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV. Much appreciated.
My absolute pleasure, and I do hope that people go to SweepSouth.com and read the report in its full form. There's a lot more there to unpack.
Yeah, well, there you go, everyone. You can go to SweepSouth.com, look at it. Very detailed report, of course, on very difficult conditions that domestic workers face within South Africa. Very trial and testing economic times. That's Luke Kannemeyer, the Group CEO of SweepSouth. Well, that's all we have for you here on News in Focus. From myself, Ross Patel, the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again on Thursday, as tomorrow is Talking Point. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.